I used to think that family bonds were unbreakable, woven from decades of shared memories, unconditional love, and mutual respect. At 78, I believed I understood the sacred nature of these connections until one fateful Wednesday afternoon when my son forgot to end our phone call, and I heard the devastating truth that would change my life forever. The revelation came like a lightning bolt on what had seemed like an ordinary day. Did the old bird buy it? My granddaughter Daisy's voice rang crystal clear through the phone speaker, followed by cruel laughter that made my blood run cold. Hook, line, and sinker. My son Dashiell replied, his voice dripping with contempt I'd never heard before. Good Lord. I'm exhausted from pretending to care about her ridiculous watercolor classes and those pathetic garden club stories. I sat frozen in my kitchen chair, my afternoon tea growing cold in my trembling hands as the conversation continued to unfold like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. These were the voices of people I'd loved unconditionally, people I'd sacrificed for, people I'd trusted with my heart and my future. Yet here they were, discussing me like I was nothing more than a foolish mark in some elaborate con game. The phone call had started innocently enough, just our weekly check-in that had become routine since my beloved husband Beauregard passed away 5 years ago. Dashiell had called right on schedule, his voice carrying that familiar distant quality I'd grown accustomed to over the years. We'd chatted about the usual things, the weather, my art classes, his work troubles, the grandchildren's latest achievements. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Mom, I hate to ask, but could you transfer about $400 to Serafina's account? He'd said toward the end of our conversation, his tone taking on that particular cadence I'd learned to recognize, slightly hesitant, slightly apologetic, the prelude to yet another financial request. The restaurant needs a deposit for Lysander's birthday dinner next week, and we're running a bit short this month. I should have questioned it more thoroughly. A restaurant requiring a cash deposit through a family member's account. It didn't make complete sense, but I'd learned not to scrutinize my family's requests too closely. After all, they were going through difficult times, and what was money compared to maintaining connections with the people I loved most in the world? Of course, sweetheart, I'd replied warmly, using the pet name I'd called him since childhood. I'll send it right over. You know I'm always happy to help. The relief in his voice had seemed genuine, his thanks heartfelt. You're wonderful, Mom. We really appreciate it. Love you. Love you too, dear. I'd responded automatically, hearing what sounded like him moving to hang up the phone. But the call didn't end. Instead, I heard shuffling sounds, then voices growing clearer and more distinct, as if he'd set the phone down without properly disconnecting. That's when Daisy's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Did the old bird buy it? The casual cruelty of those 4 words hit me like a physical blow. Old bird. That's how my granddaughter, my precious Daisy, whom I'd helped raise during her mother's difficult divorce, whom I'd supported through college, whom I'd loved as fiercely as my own daughter, that's how she referred to me when she thought I couldn't hear. Dashiell's response was even worse. Hook, line, and sinker. God, I'm so tired of these calls, pretending to care about her stupid garden club meetings and those amateur paintings she's so proud of. His voice carried a hardness I'd never heard before, a contempt that spoke of years of hidden resentment and calculated deception. My daughter-in-law Serafina's voice joined the conversation, sharp and businesslike. Well, keep up the performance. The birthday dinner will be perfect bait. She's been feeling isolated lately, so she'll definitely come and probably bring cash. You know how she always does. My grandson Lysander, barely 25, but already corrupted by this family conspiracy, chimed in with the callousness of youth, and we can bring up the reverse mortgage idea again during dinner. Dad says if we apply the right emotional pressure, she'll cave eventually. Exactly, Daisy agreed, her voice animated with excitement. Once we convince her to sign over the house, we can move her into one of those budget senior facilities. The family home is way too valuable to waste on just her. She doesn't need all that space anyway. But it was Dashiell's next words that truly shattered my world. We just need to stay patient a little longer. Her retirement account alone will set us all up nicely. Not to mention Beauregard's life insurance money that's just sitting there earning minimal interest. That money should be working for the family's future, not gathering dust in some conservative savings account. Mom's always been too naive to see what's really happening. Just like Dad always said she's weak and easily manipulated. The casual way he dismissed me, the calculation in his voice, the years of manipulation suddenly crystallizing into perfect, horrible clarity. It was almost too much to process. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a conversation taken out of context. This was a systematic, long-term plan to drain me of everything I'd worked for, everything Beauregard and I had built together during our 50-year marriage. As I sat there in my kitchen, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the photographs of family gatherings that lined my walls, I felt something inside me die. Not the dramatic death of sudden tragedy, but the slow, aching death of illusions carefully maintained over years. The family I thought I had, the love I believed surrounded me, the security I'd felt in my relationships with my children and grandchildren, all of it was crumbling like ancient paper exposed to harsh light. The phone finally went silent, the call ending with their laughter still echoing in my mind. I set the device down with hands that shook not from age, but from the profound shock of betrayal. At 78, I thought I'd experienced every kind of loss life could offer. I'd buried my parents, lost dear friends, watched my husband waste away from cancer. But this was different. This was the loss of people who were still alive, still breathing, still calling me mom and grandma while plotting to strip me of my dignity, my independence, and my hard-earned security. That night, as darkness fell around my small house and the familiar sounds of evening settled in around me, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not be anyone's victim. I would not allow the people who were supposed to love and protect me to reduce me to nothing more than a source of easy money. If my family wanted to treat me like an adversary, then they would discover just how formidable this weak and easily manipulated woman could be. The war for my independence was about to begin, and I intended to win it. The exploitation didn't happen overnight. Like most insidious forms of abuse, it crept into my life slowly, disguised as family concern and wrapped in the familiar language of love. Looking back now, I can see how carefully orchestrated it all was, how each request built upon the last, until I found myself trapped in a web of financial dependency that benefited everyone except me. It began innocently enough in the months following Beauregard's funeral. The grief was still raw, the silence in our large colonial home still deafening. When Dashiell first suggested I might be more comfortable in a smaller place. "You don't need all this space anymore, Mom," he'd said gently, his arm around my shoulders as we stood in the living room where his childhood photographs still adorned the mantelpiece. "And think of the equity you've built up over the years. It could give you a substantial nest egg for your retirement. At the time, His concern seemed genuine. The house was indeed too large for one person, and maintaining the gardens that Beauregard had lovingly tended was becoming overwhelming. The property taxes were eating into my fixed income, and climbing the stairs to our bedroom each night was becoming increasingly difficult with my arthritic knees. When Dashiell offered to help me find something more manageable, I was touched by his thoughtfulness. The sale happened quickly. The real estate market was strong that year, and our family home sold within a week for well above asking price. I found a charming single-story ranch house in a quiet neighborhood with a manageable garden and no stairs to navigate. Dashiell was incredibly helpful during the move, organizing which furniture to keep, which pieces to sell, and which items to donate to charity. It was during this transition that the first subtle financial question arose. "What are you planning to do with the proceeds from the house sale?" Dashiell asked as we sorted through Beauregard's tools in the garage. "You should really talk to a financial advisor. Make sure that money is working for you." I hadn't given it much thought. Honestly, the grief was still too fresh, the practical matters of widowhood too overwhelming. "I suppose I'll just put it in savings," I told him, feeling suddenly naive about financial matters that Beauregard had always handled. Dashiell frowned, his expression concerned. "That's not very strategic. Mom, interest rates are terrible right now. You should consider some investments. Maybe even a reverse mortgage on the new place to free up more capital for better returns." I was touched by his concern for my financial well-being. Here was my son, taking time from his busy life to worry about my future security. "I'll think about it," I promised, meaning it sincerely. The move to the ranch house was emotionally exhausting, but liberating in its own way. Downsizing meant confronting a lifetime of accumulated possessions and deciding what was truly important to keep. I found myself crying over the strangest things: Beauregard's collection of matchbooks from restaurants we'd visited, the children's height marks on the kitchen door frame that couldn't be transported, the rose bushes he'd tended so carefully that had to be left behind. But my new home had its charms. A bay window perfect for my reading chair, a kitchen with updated appliances that made cooking for one slightly less depressing, and a small garden shed that I converted into a studio for my watercolor painting. I was settling into a new routine, a new chapter of life I'd never planned for, but was learning to embrace. That's when the requests began in earnest. The first hint that something might be amiss came about 6 months after I'd moved into the ranch house. Dashiell called on a Tuesday instead of our usual Sunday, his voice carrying an urgency I wasn't accustomed to hearing. "Mom, I've been thinking," he began without his usual pleasantries. "Have you updated your will since Dad passed away?" The question caught me completely off guard. "No, I haven't gotten around to it yet. Why do you ask?" "It's just good practice," he said smoothly, his tone becoming more professional. "Making sure everything's in order, especially at your age. I have a friend who's an attorney specializing in elder law. He could help you streamline everything, make sure your wishes are crystal clear." Elder law. The term hit me like a cold splash of water. "I'm not elderly, Dashiell," I said, somewhat taken aback. "I'm just experienced." He laughed, but it sounded forced, rehearsed. "Of course, Mom, poor choice of words. But it's still smart planning to have everything properly documented. I could set up an appointment if you'd like." I demurred, saying I'd think about it, but the conversation left me feeling vaguely unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. A week later, Serafina called something she rarely did on her own. "Just checking in on my favorite mother-in-law. she said with artificial brightness. Dashiell mentioned you might be feeling a bit under the weather lately. That was news to me. I'd felt perfectly fine and hadn't mentioned any health concerns during our last conversation. Did he? I'm actually feeling quite well. Thank you. Oh, maybe I misunderstood, Serafina said quickly. How are you managing everything? Taking all your medications properly, eating well, getting enough social interaction? The questions continued, probing into my daily routine, my health habits, my social connections, and eventually, in a roundabout way, my financial situation. By the end of the call, I felt like I'd been interviewed rather than engaged in a friendly family conversation. Then the grandchildren started appearing with increasing frequency. Daisy showed up first, unannounced on a sunny Thursday afternoon, all smiles and enthusiastic compliments. Grandma, you look absolutely radiant. I love what you've done with your hair. This new place suits you perfectly. We had tea in my small garden, catching up on her life. She'd dropped out of community college and was between opportunities, as she put it, trying to find her passion and direction in life. As she was preparing to leave, she hesitated at the door, her expression suddenly vulnerable. Grandma, I hate to ask, but I'm in a really tight spot financially right now. Just until I get back on my feet and figure out my next steps. Could you maybe help me out? $5,000 would cover my rent and basic expenses for a few months while I job hunt and get my life together. $5,000 was a significant sum, but she was my granddaughter, and she looked so much like Dashiell had at that age, the same determined chin, the same expressive eyes that reminded me of Beauregard. The vulnerability in her voice, the way she fidgeted with her coffee cup, the genuine distress in her expression, it all seemed so real, so immediate. Of course, sweetheart, I heard myself saying, already mentally calculating how to transfer the money. Family helps family. That's what we do. The relief and gratitude on her face seemed authentic, her hug warm and lingering. You're the best grandmother in the world, she whispered. I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I'm stable again. I wrote the check feeling a warm glow of being needed, of being useful to my family in their time of trouble. It felt good to be able to provide for my granddaughter when she needed support most. 2 weeks later, I saw Daisy across the street from the downtown shopping district, her arms laden with shopping bags from expensive boutiques, sporting a new hairstyle that must have cost hundreds of dollars. She didn't notice me watching from the coffee shop window, too busy laughing with friends as they loaded their purchases into a shiny new car I didn't recognize. The sight left me confused and slightly hurt, but I rationalized it away. Perhaps she'd found a job. Maybe the shopping was for interviews. Young people had different priorities than my generation, and I shouldn't judge how she chose to spend her money, even if it had originally been mine. Lysander was next, arriving with what he called a business proposal rather than a direct request for money. At 25, he had inherited his father's confidence and natural charm, presenting himself with the polished demeanor of a young entrepreneur. It's a revolutionary tech startup, Grandma, he explained enthusiastically, spreading glossy printouts across my kitchen table. The papers were filled with impressive graphs, financial projections, and technical terminology I couldn't begin to understand. We're developing an application that's going to completely transform how people shop for groceries. The potential return on investment is absolutely enormous. That sounds very impressive. Dear, I said, studying the colorful charts and trying to make sense of the numbers. But I don't know anything about investing in startup companies. It seems quite risky. That's exactly why you have me," he said with a confident smile, patting my hand in a gesture that felt both affectionate and patronizing. I would never steer my favorite grandmother wrong. A $10,000 investment gets you in at the ground floor level. Conservative projections show you could easily double your money within 12 months, possibly triple it if we hit our optimistic targets. The sum was larger than Daisy's request, but Lysander's presentation was so professional, so convincing. He spoke with such authority about market trends and consumer behavior, showing me testimonials from supposed beta testers and endorsements from what appeared to be industry experts. Think of it as an investment in your grandson's future as much as your own financial security, he said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. This could set us both up for life, Grandma. You deserve to see real returns on your money instead of letting it sit in low-interest savings accounts. Against my better judgment, I found myself writing another check. Lysander's confidence was infectious, and the idea of being part of something innovative and potentially lucrative was appealing. Maybe this was exactly what I needed, a way to make my money work harder while supporting my grandson's entrepreneurial ambitions. 6 months later, when I casually asked Dashiell during one of our weekly calls how Lysander's business venture was progressing, he looked momentarily confused. "Oh, that startup thing. It didn't work out. These tech ventures are notoriously unpredictable, high risk, high reward. You know, sometimes the market just isn't ready for innovation." He shrugged dismissively. Lysander learned a valuable lesson about entrepreneurship, though these experiences are educational, even when they don't pan out financially. The next time I saw Lysander, he was driving a sleek new sports car, wearing expensive clothes, and talking about his upcoming vacation to Europe with friends. When I mentioned the failed startup, he brushed it off with the same casual indifference his father had shown. "Yeah, that didn't work out," he said with a shrug. "But that's the startup world for you. You win some, you lose some. I'm on to bigger and better things now." The pattern was becoming clear, though I wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. Each visit from my family members followed the same script-warm greetings, genuine seeming interest in my well-being, catching up on family news, and then, almost as an afterthought, a financial request, car repairs for Daisy, graduate school expenses for Lysander, home improvements for Dashiell and Serafina, medical bills, travel emergencies, investment opportunities that couldn't wait. Each time, I wrote the checks, telling myself this was what grandmothers did. This was how families supported each other through difficult times. The amounts varied, sometimes a few $100s, sometimes several thousand, but the pattern never changed. Money flowed out of my accounts and into theirs, with promises of repayment that never materialized and gratitude that seemed to diminish with each transaction. My savings account, once robust enough to ensure a comfortable retirement, began to dwindle steadily. I found myself cutting back on small luxuries, canceling my symphony subscription, shopping at discount stores instead of the groceries I preferred, declining lunch invitations because restaurant meals had become a budget concern. Meanwhile, my family's circumstances seemed to improve dramatically. Kitchen renovations at Dashiell and Serafina's house, new cars appearing in their driveway, exotic vacation photos posted on social media, designer handbags, and expensive jewelry that somehow materialized despite their frequent claims of financial hardship. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but I couldn't bring myself to connect the dots. These were the people I loved most in the world, the family I'd nurtured and supported throughout their lives. Surely they wouldn't deliberately take advantage of my generosity. Surely there was some explanation for the discrepancy between their requests for help and their apparent prosperity. I was trapped in the painful space between love and awareness, between hope and growing suspicion, unable to fully acknowledge what was happening, because doing so would mean accepting a betrayal too devastating to contemplate. The financial manipulation was only one prong of their carefully orchestrated campaign. What I failed to recognize at the time was how systematically my family was working to isolate me from any source of support or independent judgment that might threaten their control over my resources. They understood instinctively that a lonely, dependent, elderly woman was far easier to manipulate than one with strong social connections and emotional alternatives. The most devastating example of this isolation came through their sabotage of my relationship with Cornelius, a man who had brought unexpected joy back into my life during one of my darkest periods. I met Cornelius at a community center dance for seniors, about 18 months after Beauregard's passing. The grief had finally begun to soften around the edges, allowing space for other emotions to emerge. I'd been reluctant to attend the dance. It felt somehow disloyal to Beauregard's memory, but my sister Magnolia had practically dragged me there, insisting that sitting alone in my house every evening wasn't healthy. Cornelius was 75, a retired civil engineer who had immigrated from Romania in his 30s. His accent was still thick after 4 decades in America. His eyebrows were magnificently unruly, and his laugh was absolutely infectious. When he asked me to dance to a Frank Sinatra song, his old-world charm was immediately captivating. "You move like a much younger woman," he told me as we swayed to the music, his hand warm and steady on my waist, like a spring breeze bringing life back to winter ground. No one had flirted with me in years. I felt a blush creep up my neck and found myself giggling like a schoolgirl. For the first time since Beauregard's diagnosis, I felt young again, alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Cornelius asked for my phone number, and I gave it without hesitation. Our first official date was to a matinee at the Old Theater downtown, followed by coffee at a little cafe where he knew the owner, another Romanian expatriate, who treated us to homemade pastries and stories about the old country. Cornelius told me about his late wife, Elena, about his children who lived on the West Coast, about his life in Bucharest before coming to America with nothing but hope and determination. I shared stories about Beauregard, about my watercolor painting, about the garden I was learning to tend on my own. We discovered shared loves of classical music and historical documentaries, of quiet mornings and long conversations about books we'd read. He became a regular fixture in my life museum visits on Wednesdays, dinner at his condominium or my house on Saturdays, occasional day trips to coastal towns I'd never explored, despite living relatively close to the ocean for most of my adult life. For the first time since Beauregard died, I felt truly alive again, seen and appreciated for who I was rather than defined solely by my widowhood or my usefulness to others. When I mentioned Cornelius to Dashiell during one of our weekly phone calls, his reaction was immediate and alarming. The warmth in his voice disappeared instantly, replaced by a sharp edge of concern that felt more like interrogation than family interest. "Mom, you barely know this guy," he said, his tone taking on the authoritative quality he used when discussing my financial decisions. "How much have you told him about your personal situation, about your finances?" The question caught me off guard. "Nothing about money, if that's what you're asking. We talk about art and music and travel, about books and current events, normal conversation topics. You need to be extremely careful, Daschle insisted, his voice growing more urgent. There are countless scammers out there who specifically target seniors, especially lonely widows with substantial savings. It's practically an epidemic. Mom, these predators are sophisticated. They know exactly how to seem charming and trustworthy. I felt a chill of doubt creep into my mind, even as I protested. Cornelius isn't like that at all. He owns his condominium outright, has an excellent pension from his engineering career, drives a modest but well-maintained car. He's clearly not interested in my money. That's exactly what they want you to think, Daschle countered smoothly. The successful ones never seem desperate or obvious about it. They play the long game, building trust and emotional dependency before they strike. Has he suggested any investments, asked about your living situation, shown interest in your financial planning? The conversation planted seeds of doubt that I couldn't quite shake. Despite the lack of any evidence supporting Daschle's suspicions, Cornelius had never asked about my finances, never suggested I change my investment strategy, never even hinted at wanting to know details about my resources. Our relationship was built on companionship, shared interests, and genuine affection. But once Daschle had introduced the possibility of deception, I found myself watching for signs I'd previously ignored, analyzing innocent comments for hidden meanings, second-guessing gestures of kindness that had once felt natural and genuine. The psychological warfare escalated when the entire family became involved in undermining my relationship. Serafina began making pointed comments about foreign men and their different cultural attitudes toward women and money. She'd reference news stories about romance scams, always with the disclaimer that she wasn't implying anything specific about Cornelius, just wanting me to be aware of the risks. These Eastern European men have very different ideas about family obligations and elder care, she said during one particularly uncomfortable conversation. In their culture, it's expected that older women provide for younger male relatives. They see American widows as easy targets for that kind of exploitation. The comments were subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability while being devastating effective at undermining my confidence in the relationship. Even when I pointed out that Cornelius had never asked for anything and seemed to have his own financial stability, Serafina would nod sympathetically and say, "Of course, dear, they're very patient. That's what makes them so dangerous." Daisy and Lysander joined the campaign with the casual cruelty of young adults who saw my romantic life as vaguely embarrassing and potentially threatening to their inheritance prospects. They'd make jokes about Grandma's boyfriend that carried undertones of mockery and disapproval, treating my relationship as a mild form of senile delusion rather than a genuine human connection. "Just be careful, Grandma," Daisy said during one visit, her tone suggesting she was being mature and protective. "Men his age are usually looking for someone to take care of them, if you know what I mean. You don't want to end up being anyone's meal ticket." The most insidious part of their campaign was how they began sabotaging my time with Cornelius through a series of carefully orchestrated emergencies and urgent family obligations. Daschle would call whenever he knew Cornelius and I had plans, suddenly needing immediate help with some crisis that couldn't wait. Serafina would schedule family lunches that deliberately conflicted with our outings, forcing me to choose between my new relationship and family obligations. They began dropping by my house unannounced whenever they suspected Cornelius might be visiting, creating awkward situations where he would politely excuse himself rather than impose on family time. These surprise visits always carried an air of inspection, as if they were checking up on me and evaluating whether I was being properly supervised. The pressure became overwhelming. Every time I spent time with Cornelius, I felt guilty about disappointing my family. Every family gathering became an opportunity for subtle but persistent commentary about the risks I was taking, the poor judgment I was showing, the way I was dishonoring Beauregard's memory by moving on too quickly. The breaking point came when Dashiell finally played his most devastating card. During what started as a routine phone call, he brought up Cornelius with unusual directness. "Mom, I need to say something, and I hope you'll really listen," he began, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine emotion. "This relationship with this foreign stranger, it's disrespectful to Dad's memory. You're making choices that would hurt him deeply if he were alive to see them." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. The idea that I was somehow betraying Beauregard, the love of my life, by finding companionship and happiness again was devastating beyond words. The guilt crashed over me in waves, mixing with the constant doubts my family had been planting about Cornelius's motives. "Your father would want me to be happy," I managed to say through tears that felt like they were being torn from my soul. "Dad would want you to be safe," Dashiell countered, his voice firm but gentle. "He'd want you to make smart decisions, not be taken advantage of by some smooth-talking immigrant who sees dollar signs when he looks at you." That night, I called Cornelius and ended our relationship. The conversation was one of the most painful of my life. His confusion and hurt were evident, even through his thick accent, his voice growing quieter as he tried to understand what had changed so suddenly. "They are wrong about me. Vivian," he said simply, using the formal version of my name that he always pronounced with such careful respect. "But I understand that family is important. Family must come first, always. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." The dignity with which he accepted my decision only made the loss more devastating. I'd given up someone who genuinely cared for me, someone who saw me as a complete person rather than a resource to be managed, because my family had convinced me that love at my age was either impossible or dangerous. With Cornelius out of my life, my world contracted dramatically. My family had successfully eliminated the one person who might have provided an alternative perspective on their behavior, the one relationship that existed independently of their control and manipulation. Without his presence in my life, I had no buffer against their increasing demands, no reminder that I deserved to be treated with respect and affection rather than calculation and contempt. The isolation was carefully maintained through other subtle means. When I mentioned enjoying my garden club meetings, Serafina would schedule family obligations that conflicted with those gatherings. When I talked about my watercolor class, Dashiell would suggest that perhaps I was overextending myself, that maybe I should focus on simpler activities more appropriate for someone my age. They began monitoring my social interactions with the dedication of professional surveillance. Phone calls were noted and commented upon. Social outings required detailed explanations. New friendships were subjected to suspicious scrutiny, with gentle suggestions that I might be too trusting, too naive about people's real motivations. The psychological impact was profound and intentional. I began to doubt my own judgment about people and situations. If my family was right about Cornelius, if I was truly too naive to recognize predatory behavior, then perhaps I couldn't trust my instincts about anyone. Maybe I really did need their guidance and protection to navigate a world full of people who might take advantage of my supposedly obvious vulnerabilities. The isolation made me increasingly dependent on my family for social connection and emotional support, which gave them even more leverage to influence my decisions and extract financial concessions. Every check I wrote, every request I honored, felt like a small price to pay for maintaining my connection to the only people left in my life who claimed to love me. I didn't recognize until much later that this isolation was the foundation upon which all their other manipulations rested. A person with strong independent relationships is much harder to control than someone whose entire social world revolves around the very people who are exploiting them. By systematically eliminating my external sources of support and perspective, they created a closed system where their version of reality was the only one I encountered on a regular basis. The loneliness was crushing, but I told myself it was temporary, that once I proved my family loyalty by prioritizing their needs and concerns, the relationships would return to their former warmth and authenticity. I didn't understand that the coldness, the calculation, the conditional nature of their affection that was the authentic relationship. Everything else had been performance, carefully maintained only as long as it served their ultimate purposes. The hours following that devastating phone call passed in a strange suspension of time, as if the world had shifted on its axis and I was waiting for gravity to reassert itself. I sat motionless in my kitchen chair as darkness fell and gradually gave way to the gray light of dawn, the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest like a physical force. The grief was different from losing Beauregard when he died. I lost someone who loved me unconditionally. This was losing people I thought loved me, only to discover that love had been conditional all along, dependent entirely on what I could provide in dollars and cents. But as that first morning light filtered through my kitchen windows, something fundamental shifted inside me. The initial shock was giving way to something harder, more focused. If these people, my own flesh and blood, wanted to treat me like an adversary, then they would discover just how formidable this supposedly weak and easily manipulated woman could be when pushed too far. The first call I made was to my sister Magnolia. Despite the early hour, she answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert with concern. "Vivian, is everything all right? You sound terrible." "No," I said simply, and then the words poured out of me like water through a broken dam. Every cruel comment I'd overheard, every calculated plan they'd discussed, every moment of realization about how systematically I'd been deceived and exploited. As I spoke, my voice grew steadier, my resolve stronger. Naming the betrayal aloud somehow diminished its power over me. Magnolia was silent for a long moment after I finished. Then, in her characteristically direct way, she said, "I'm coming over right now. Don't do anything until I get there. And Vivian, I'm proud of you for finally seeing what the rest of us have been watching with horror for months." She arrived within the hour, bringing coffee from my favorite bakery and her trademark no-nonsense attitude. At 83, my sister was still a force of nature, her silver hair cut in a sharp, stylish bob, her posture ramrod straight despite the arthritis that plagued her on rainy days, her blue eyes sharp with intelligence and righteous anger. "I should have listened to you," I said, tears finally flowing as she enveloped me in a fierce hug that smelled of her familiar lavender perfume. "You saw through them all along, and I was too stubborn to hear it." "Doesn't matter now," she said briskly, setting down her purse and the cardboard tray of coffee cups with military precision. "What matters is what we do next, And sweetheart, we're going to do plenty. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd received that life-altering phone call, and began crafting a plan of action. Magnolia had always been the practical one in our family, the strategist to my dreamer, and now her clarity of thought was exactly what I needed to navigate this crisis. First things first, she said, pulling out a leather-bound notepad and an expensive pen from her purse. We need to protect your assets immediately, before they realize you've discovered their scheme. What kind of access does Dashiell have to your accounts currently? I explained the shared access I'd granted him to monitor my financial situation, the credit cards where I'd made them authorized users for emergencies, the joint checking account we'd established so he could help me manage expenses if I ever became incapacitated. Magnolia made meticulous notes, her handwriting as precise and controlled as everything else about her. All of that needs to be changed today, this morning, if possible. The moment they realize their conversation was overheard, they'll try to drain whatever they can before you can stop them. But what will I tell them? I asked, still caught in the web of familial obligation despite everything I'd learned. How do I explain suddenly revoking their access without admitting I heard their conversation? Magnolia looked at me with the patient expression she'd worn when teaching me to drive 50 years earlier. Vivian, dear, you don't owe them any explanations. They forfeited the right to honest communication when they started scheming to steal your life savings. We secure your finances first, then decide how to handle the inevitable confrontation. She reached across the table and took my hands in hers, her blue eyes so like mine, so like our mothers, holding my gaze with steady confidence. Your kindness has never been weakness, despite what those vultures might think. Your generosity came from love, and their exploitation of that love is their moral failure, not yours. We're going to fix this situation together, and when we're done, you're going to be stronger and more secure than you've been in years. Her confidence in me was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I clung to it, drawing strength from her certainty when my own was shattered and scattered. Okay, I said, squaring my shoulders in a gesture I'd inherited from our mother. Tell me exactly what to do. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of decisive action that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd spent so many years deferring to others, accepting their judgment about what was best for me, that taking control of my own affairs felt like learning to walk again after a long illness. My first call was to the bank, where I spoke with a customer service representative who was helpful but understandably concerned about the sudden changes I was requesting. Mrs. Hamilton, are you certain you want to remove your son from all these accounts? He's been an authorized user for quite some time, and these kinds of changes can create family complications. I'm absolutely certain, I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. In fact, I'd like to open entirely new accounts at a different branch and transfer all my funds there. I want to change all my passwords, security questions, and contact information. I want a completely fresh start. Next, I called each credit card company where I'd made family members authorized users. The process was surprisingly straightforward once I explained that I was revoking their privileges due to changed family circumstances. One representative asked if there had been fraudulent charges I wanted to report. No, I said after a moment's consideration. Not fraudulent exactly, just unauthorized in spirit, if not in letter. I blocked their phone numbers, changed my email passwords, and made an appointment with an attorney, not the elder law specialist Dashiell had recommended, but Margaret Kowalski, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s who had handled Magnolia's legal affairs for years. Financial exploitation of seniors is unfortunately more common than most people realize, Margaret told me during our consultation, her expression professionally sympathetic but businesslike. It's even more prevalent when family members are the perpetrators because they typically have access, established trust, and often a sense of entitlement to the senior's assets. What can I do to protect myself going forward? I asked, feeling both vulnerable and determined. Quite a lot, actually, she replied, pulling out a fresh legal pad. We'll start by creating a revocable trust for your assets, with very specific provisions for your care and clear instructions about distribution. We'll update your will, removing Dashiell as executor and naming someone you trust implicitly, perhaps your sister. We'll establish new financial and health care powers of attorney, naming someone other than your son. She paused, her pen hovering over her notes. I'm also going to document this conversation and your reasons for these changes in detail, in case there's ever a legal challenge to your mental competency. Unfortunately, when adult children are cut off from expected inheritances, they sometimes claim their parent was incompetent when making those decisions. The implications sent a chill through me. The idea that Dashiell might question my sanity, rather than acknowledge his own wrongdoing, spoke volumes about how far our relationship had deteriorated, but it also highlighted how necessary these protections were. When the day of Lysander's supposed birthday dinner arrived, the event they'd used as bait to extract money from me, I wasn't there. I sent no gift, no card, no explanation for my absence. Instead, I was touring retirement communities with Magnolia, not the affordable assisted living facilities Dashiell had mentioned in his cruel conversation, but vibrant, active senior communities where I could maintain my independence while having access to security and social connections. This community has a dedicated art studio for residents, the tour guide at Sunrise Manor explained, showing us a bright, airy space lined with easels and canvases. We have several professional artists living here, and they offer classes for all skill levels. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of genuine interest. Do they have exhibitions or gallery showings twice a year? The guide confirmed enthusiastically. And we partner with the local community college for special workshops and lectures. Many of our residents discover they have more time and energy to pursue their artistic passions once they're freed from the burdens of home maintenance and social isolation. By the end of the day, I had put down a deposit on a beautiful one-bedroom apartment with a small den that could serve as my private studio. The community offered 24-hour security, a dining room for times when I didn't feel like cooking, transportation to medical appointments and shopping centers, and most importantly, a sense of genuine community that had been missing from my life since Beauregard's death. Are you absolutely sure about this? Magnolia asked as we drove home in her pristine sedan. It's a significant change, and once word gets out, there's no going back to the way things were. I'm more sure about this than I've been about anything in years, I replied, feeling a sense of certainty that surprised me with its strength. I need a completely fresh start, somewhere they can't find me easily, somewhere I can rebuild my life on my own terms. The emergency calls and messages started that very evening. First Dashiell, then Serafina, then even Daisy and Lysander voicemails filled with confusion and concern, text messages demanding explanations, emails that alternated between wounded bewilderment and subtle threats about my concerning behavior. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I stayed with Magnolia until the professional moving company I'd hired could pack and transport my belongings. We'd arranged for a security service to oversee the entire process, just in case Dashiell or the others tried to interfere with the move or claim ownership of items they'd given me over the years. They didn't attempt to physically intervene, but Dashiell's car made several slow passes by Magnolia's house during my stay. They're a silent reminder that this confrontation was far from over. I listed my ranch house for sale through a different real estate agent than the one who'd helped me buy it, someone with no connection to my family. When it sold 2 weeks later for significantly more than I'd paid, I put the proceeds into the carefully structured trust Margaret had created, with ironclad provisions for my care and specific instructions about who could and could not access the funds under any circumstances. The hardest part of this transformation was changing my phone number and email address, essentially disappearing from the life I'd known for decades. It felt extreme, but as Margaret had explained, sometimes the only way to completely stop financial exploitation is to remove yourself entirely from the exploiter's reach. I left no forwarding address with any local businesses or services, no way for them to track me down easily. The post office would forward mail for 6 months, but after that, any correspondence would be returned to sender. As I prepared to move into my new life at Sunrise Manor, I felt a complex mixture of grief and liberation. I was mourning the loss of the family I'd thought I had, while simultaneously celebrating my escape from people who had viewed me as nothing more than a convenient source of funding for their lifestyle improvements. The woman who had been systematically isolated, manipulated, and financially exploited was gone. In her place stood someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more determined to live life on her own terms. At 78, I was finally ready to discover who I could become when I stopped being defined by what others expected me to provide. The day I moved into Sunrise Manor was both the end of one life and the beginning of another. As the moving truck pulled away from the elegant entrance, leaving me surrounded by carefully labeled boxes in my new one-bedroom apartment, I felt a profound sense of both loss and possibility. At 78, I was starting over completely no family connections, no established routines, no familiar neighborhood landmarks to anchor me to my past. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Magnolia helped me arrange my furniture and hang my watercolor paintings on the pristine white walls. The apartment was smaller than my ranch house had been, but it felt perfectly proportioned for my needs. The east-facing windows in the living room would be ideal for morning painting sessions, and the small den off the main room was already transforming in my mind into the art studio I'd always dreamed of having. "You're going to be genuinely happy here," Magnolia said as we shared a cup of Earl Grey tea on my new balcony, overlooking the beautifully maintained community gardens where several residents were already working among the flower beds despite the late afternoon hour. "I can feel it in the air around you. You're finally breathing freely again." "I think you're absolutely right," I replied, and for the first time in years, I meant it completely. For the first time since Beauregard's death, I felt a genuine sense of possibility stretching out before me, a future that belonged entirely to me rather than being defined by others' expectations or demands. That first night, alone in my new home, with my belongings still mostly packed in boxes, I allowed myself to cry for everything I had lost. Not the money or the possessions. Those were just things, replaceable and ultimately unimportant, but the illusion of family love, the belief that I was cherished for who I was rather than what I could provide. It was a necessary grieving process, a final letting go of relationships that had never really existed except in my hopeful imagination. But as I unpacked my art supplies the next morning, setting up my easel by the east-facing window, where the light was absolutely perfect, I felt something else growing alongside the grief. A quiet determination, a sense of reclaiming my identity and my life on my own terms. I was 78 years old, but I wasn't finished living, not by a long shot. The transition into community life was easier than I had anticipated. My new neighbors were welcoming without being intrusive, friendly without being overwhelming. There was an immediate sense of shared understanding among people who had all made the conscious choice to create new lives for themselves in this place, whether by choice or necessity. Margaret, a retired English literature professor with silver hair and laugh lines around her bright green eyes, knocked on my door the second day with a plate of homemade cookies and an invitation to join the community book club. "We're reading contemporary fiction this month," she explained, "but we also discuss everything from poetry to political biographies. The conversations get quite lively. I think you'd enjoy the intellectual stimulation." Carlos, a widower who tended the community vegetable garden with the dedication of someone who understood that growing things was a form of hope made tangible, stopped by with a basket of fresh tomatoes and an offer to show me the best spots for planting herbs if I was interested in having a small garden plot of my own. "The soil here is excellent," he told me, his weathered hands gentle as he showed me the perfect ripeness of his tomatoes. "And there's something deeply satisfying about growing your own food, especially when you have the time to really pay attention to the process." Elaine, a former ballet dancer whose posture still reflected decades of disciplined grace, taught gentle yoga classes for residents 3 times a week. "It's never too late to improve flexibility and balance," she assured me when I expressed doubt about my arthritic knees. "We modify everything for different ability levels, and the community we build in those classes is as healing as the physical practice." Within a month, I had established new routines that felt both comfortable and energizing. Morning painting sessions by my east window became my meditation time, watching the light change across the canvas as I worked on landscapes inspired by the view from my balcony. Wednesday afternoon book club meetings with Margaret's group introduced me to authors and ideas I might never have discovered on my own. Carlos's gardening tutorials gave me a small herb plot that provided fresh basil, rosemary, and time for my cooking experiments. But perhaps the most healing aspect of my new life was the gradual rebuilding of my relationship with Cornelius. I learned that he taught ballroom dance classes at the community center 3 evenings a week and 1 Tuesday night. I gathered the courage to attend. The reunion was awkward at first. I was full of apologies for how abruptly I'd ended our relationship, while he maintained the gracious but wary demeanor of someone who had been hurt and wasn't eager to be hurt again. But gradually, over several weeks of careful conversation and shared cups of coffee after dance class, we began to rebuild our connection. "I understood that your family was important," he told me one evening as we sat in the community center's garden after class. "Family should come first, always, but I also knew they were wrong about me, and I hoped someday you would see that too. They convinced me that caring for someone new meant betraying Beauregard's memory." I admitted, my voice thick with regret. "I let their fears and prejudices override my own instincts about you, about us. I'm so sorry for that." Cornelius reached across the small table and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady. "We are both older now, perhaps wiser. If you would like, we can try again, but slowly this time, without the pressure of family approval or disapproval, just as ourselves. This second chance at companionship felt different, deeper, and more grounded than our first relationship had been. We were taking our time, enjoying each other's company without rushing toward any particular destination. He made me laugh with his stories about learning American customs, challenged my thinking with his perspectives on art and history, and appreciated my watercolor paintings with an enthusiasm that felt genuine and informed. "You paint like someone who has seen both great beauty and profound sorrow," he observed one afternoon, studying a landscape I'd just completed. "There is honesty in your brushstrokes, a depth that comes from understanding loss and still choosing to create something beautiful." I had made other meaningful friendships as well. Beyond the warm acquaintanceship with my immediate neighbors, I connected with fellow artists in the community studio, joined a weekly poker game that was more about conversation than gambling, and volunteered to teach watercolor basics to residents who had never picked up a paintbrush but were curious about trying. The financial protections I'd put in place proved to be absolutely necessary. Dashiell found me. Eventually, he was my son, after all, and he knew my preferences and habits well enough to track me down, despite my efforts at secrecy. He arrived at Sunrise Manor one afternoon, about 4 months after I'd moved in, carrying a bouquet of white lilies and wearing his most charming smile. "Mom," he said when I met him in the community center, rather than inviting him to my private apartment, "we've all been worried sick about you. Why did you disappear like that? Why won't you return our calls or answer our messages?" I looked at my son, my only child, the baby I had nursed through countless illnesses, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and tie his shoes, the man I had helped through college and his first apartment, and felt a complex mixture of love and profound weariness. "I think you know exactly why." "Dashiell," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the pain that still lanced through my heart at seeing him. "I honestly don't," he insisted, his expression perfectly crafted to convey confusion and hurt. "We've been absolutely frantic. Serafina's been beside herself with worry. The kids keep asking when they'll see their grandmother again." "You forgot to hang up the phone," I said simply. "After you asked me for money for Lysander's birthday dinner, I heard everything you, Serafina, Daisy, Lysander. I heard what you really think of me, what you've been planning." His face went through a remarkable series of transformations: shock, denial, rapid calculation, and finally, a kind of resigned acknowledgement of being caught. "Mom, you completely misunderstood what you heard. We were just... Please don't insult my intelligence by lying to me now." I interrupted, my voice remaining calm but firm. "I heard you call me stupid and weak. I heard your detailed plans for my house, my retirement account, Beauregard's life insurance money. I heard it all. Dashiell, every cruel word." He was silent for a long moment, his hands fidgeting with the cellophane wrapping around the lilies he'd brought as a peace offering. "We're family," he said finally, as if that simple fact explained everything and excused everything. "Yes, we are," I agreed, which is exactly why it hurts so deeply to discover how you really feel about me. Family should be built on love, respect, and mutual support, not exploitation disguised as concern. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Dashiell alternating between apologies that sounded hollow and justifications that revealed the depth of his sense of entitlement to my resources. When he finally left, the lilies abandoned on the table between us, I felt both exhausted and oddly relieved. The confrontation I dreaded had happened, and I had survived it with my dignity and resolve intact. I haven't heard from him directly since that visit, though other family members have made various attempts at contact. Serafina called once with false concern about whether I was getting the care I need. Lysander sent a text suggesting we should talk about what's really going on. Daisy left a voicemail full of tears and accusations about how I'd abandoned the family. I didn't respond to any of them. The door to reconciliation remains slightly ajar if they ever want a genuine relationship based on love and respect rather than financial exploitation. They know where to find me, but I'm not waiting by the phone or holding my breath for that transformation. Instead, I focus on the rich, meaningful life I'm building here. I've joined a more serious art group in town and even sold several paintings at the community's biannual exhibition. I volunteer at the local elementary school, teaching watercolor basics to third graders who approach their canvases with joyful abandon. I've made friends who value my company, my conversation, and my perspective, not what I can give them materially. At 78, I'm finally living authentically for myself, painting my remaining years in colors of my own choosing. Each morning brings new possibilities, new connections, new opportunities to create something beautiful or meaningful. The canvas of my life is mine to fill, no longer serving as background for others' desires, but as a masterpiece in its own right, vibrant with hard-won wisdom and unexpected joy. As I sit in my sunlit apartment at Sunrise Manor, surrounded by my watercolor paintings and the genuine friendships I've cultivated over these past months, I've come to understand a fundamental truth that took me 78 years to fully grasp. Family isn't defined by blood relations or legal documents. True family is built on mutual respect, unconditional love, and the kind of support that asks for nothing in return except the joy of seeing each other flourish. The people who share my DNA treated me like a resource to be managed and eventually depleted. But here, among chosen companions who knew nothing of my past wealth or family complications, I found the authentic connections I'd been searching for my entire life. Magnolia, my sister by blood, proved that biological family can be genuine when built on love rather than expectation. Cornelius showed me that romantic companionship doesn't end at 75. Margaret, Carlos, and Elaine demonstrated that friendships formed in later life can be every bit as meaningful as those forged in youth. Real family celebrates your independence rather than undermining it. True loved ones encourage your growth instead of manipulating your vulnerabilities. Authentic relationships are based on who you are, not what you can provide. At any age, we have the power to choose our family, to surround ourselves with people who see our worth beyond our bank account balance or inheritance potential. The most profound lesson I've learned isn't about protecting yourself from financial exploitation, though that's certainly important. It's about recognizing your own inherent worth and refusing to accept relationships that diminish your dignity. For decades, I believed that love required sacrifice without reciprocity, that being a good mother and grandmother meant endlessly giving without ever expecting genuine appreciation in return. I was wrong. Love shouldn't cost you your peace of mind, your financial security, or your self-respect. Healthy relationships involve mutual care, honest communication, and respect for boundaries. When someone consistently takes without giving back, when they manipulate your emotions to access your resources, when they make you feel guilty for having needs or setting limits that isn't love, that's exploitation wearing love's mask. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns in your own life, please know that it's never too late to reclaim your power. You deserve relationships that celebrate who you are, not what you can provide. You have the right to set boundaries, to say no, to protect yourself from those who would drain your spirit along with your savings account. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong in a relationship, it probably is. Don't let anyone convince you that your desire for respect and genuine affection is asking too much. You are worthy of authentic love at every age, in every circumstance. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between family loyalty and self-protection? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Together, we can remind each other that our worth isn't measured by what we give away, but by the courage we show in choosing to live authentically.